My name is Magnus Bäck. I work in access communications with various IFL-related matters and lots of other things too. And this session is about the recent changes in the protocol, or at least planned changes. So this can be a little bit technical. You're going to earn that fika. It can be a two-part presentation. So this first 30 minutes is going to be around one topic that hasn't quite been put into stone yet. So if you don't agree with me, there are opportunities for changing this proposal. And some of the other changes that I'm going to talk about after the break, I think, is they have in some cases been merged. So there's more historical record. Some of it is actually a repeat of last year's presentation. So some of you might remember it. So I'm going to talk about modeling container images, because we feel that hasn't really been properly covered so far in IFL. So why would you even want to do that? Well, in some cases, your actual output is a container image. In other cases, you just use container images to build other artifacts that are interesting to you. So in this case, you have you want to model the creation of the container image itself. So in other words, you are sending an artifact. This is actually the official icon for a container image, according to the Open Container Initiative. So I'm using that here to show that this artifact is the container itself. So in this case, you want to capture that you're creating this container image artifact in the context of a particular activity. It could be a Jenkins job or a GitHub workflow. And you are building that container image from a particular piece of source code. And that's what you want to capture. That's the point. The container image might be your final output that is used in production or towards customers, for example. That's one way of using it. Another is if your main artifact is actually something else, in this case, a Python package. And what you want to record is that you're building the Python package in the context of a container image. And that container image might be the one that was built on the previous slide. So those are two different ways of having a reason for modeling container images. And as I said, there's no really good way of doing it in IFL today. And if you know a little bit about IFL and a little bit about the package URLs that are used to describe and identify artifacts, you might think that is pretty obvious, because there is a container image type in the package URL specification, and it looks like this. So you might think, well, we just use this. That's what I thought at first as well. But then I started looking into the details, and I realized that it's not quite that simple. Because first of all, when we talk about identity, I think it's really nice if entities have a single identity. That's kind of the point of identities. But as you can see here, these are three different and possibly equivalent identities of the same thing. In the first case, we have a name of the image, and we have a version. But the version in this case is very mutable. It changes every day. So it's very convenient if you only want to get the most recent Trixie image of Debian, you can just pull the Trixie image and you'll get that every day. That's very convenient. But it changes every day. So it's not very good for traceability to say afterwards, oh, I built with the Trixie image. Sure, but which one of the hundreds of Trixie images? If you want to have it a little bit more locked down, they also offer one that includes the date it was built. It's still technically at least mutable. It could change over time. Probably doesn't, but it could. But for traceability purposes, it's still not great. On the other hand, at the very bottom, you could express your package identity like this using the SHA-256 of the image. So from a traceability point of view, it's great because we know exactly what image was used in this case. On the other hand, if you want to capture what the build requested, what do they want to build? The build probably didn't request the SHA-256. Could have been, but it could very well be that it requested perhaps the Trixie image. So from my point of view, ideally, I want to be able to see that the build requested a Trixie image, and this exact one is what it got. Then it captures all the information that I want to need. Then, of course, I want to know what went into this image, of course. But that's what I want to capture in my build. And there's really no good way of doing this. You would have to pick one of these three identities for your container images, and then you can't link these together. So theoretically, you could send multiple artifacts created with different identities, but you can't connect them. So it's a bit of a mess. So that's what we're trying to solve. So we look at the life cycles of container images and try to compare them to the different Eiffel events that we have on the menu. We could note that there's a very similarity between the act of building a container image and the artifact created event. If you know the Docker CLI, you might recognize the command on the top left. That's when you build an image. It doesn't leave your machine at all. It's just the act of building it. And that's pretty much exactly what the artifact created event expresses. We create an artifact. We don't make it available anywhere. It's just, it's there. It has an identity and a version, and we can express what was it built from, for example. On the other hand, when you run the Docker push command, then you make it available somewhere. You push it to a Docker registry, and other people can download your stuff. That's pretty much what the artifact published event does. That's where we announce the URL of an artifact. You can download from here. We can announce multiple URLs for the same artifact. So given that this mapping works out pretty well, I think it would be a bad idea to not use the similarity to actually model these real world events. So one problem here is that what is even the URI of a container image? You added them using this syntax right here, but that's not a URL. I don't even know what it's called. Here's the name of a Docker registry and an image name and a tag. So it's terminology. I'm not super happy with it. But what actually happens when you run Docker pull is that this, the container name, let's call it, is transformed to the following URI. And that's standardized. That's what actually happens. This fetches the manifest file or manifest JSON blob, which contains the URIs of all the layers in the image and some other metadata. So this URI here is really just another way of expressing this. So that means that this is a URI we can stick into an artifact published event. So here we can, on the top event, the artifact created, we can express, we're using the full SHA-256 representation of the image, which is non-mutable. We don't say anything. We could, Linnér mentioned that earlier, but package URLs for container images could include an attribute that states the registry URI, in other words, where you can download it. But we shouldn't include it here because it's not part of the identity of the image itself. The image itself doesn't know where it's stored. It doesn't even know which name it has. It only knows its SHA-256 identity, which is intrinsic to the image. So when we build the image, we can send the artifact created with the SHA-256 identity. And every time we push this image to a registry and make it available, then we can send the artifact published and include the URI of the manifest file. It's not like anyone is ever going to download this exact URI, but consumers of the event that understand this form of URI could turn it into this here that could be fed to a Docker pull operation or a pod specification for Kubernetes or something else. And in this way, we can express that there are multiple names of the image artifact. At some point, both the stable and the latest image tags pointed to the same image. This will, of course, change over time, but we can capture all those movements. This also allows us to, for example, capture sort of the history of an image tag. I mean, what's the sort of version history of the stable tag over time, which is a pretty nice thing, I think. And it also means that someone that runs a build of something like the Python package I talked about earlier, or for whatever other reason wants to link to a container image, they could choose to link to either of these, depending on the intention. What was the intention of the build? Did they ask for the latest image? Did they ask for the stable image? Or what did they ask for? And we'll capture that. So they would link here, and you could follow that link to see what was the actual exact build that was used. I think that's really nice. We do need a couple of rather small changes to the protocol. The first one isn't technically necessary, but I think it's a good idea. In the artifact publish event, you list one or more locations for the files in the artifact. Each location has a type. That's usually, I think, other or something like that, meaning that it doesn't mean anything in particular. It's just a URI. But it's an enumeration for the type field. And we suggest that a new value for that enum is added, OCI manifest, to indicate that this particular URI is an OCI manifest. That could be transformed into a container image name that you could pull. Secondly, the events that currently allow links to artifact created, they would have to be changed somewhat to also allow the link to artifact published. And that would allow us to do this. Otherwise, or as it stands, you can only link to the artifact created. You could still, of course, have this complete graph, but you wouldn't be able to capture the intention of whoever is doing the linking. So we have to allow links also to the artifact published. That could be a little bit controversial, because theoretically, you're not really interested in what URL was an artifact fetched from. Theoretically, it shouldn't matter because they all link to the same underlying artifact, which doesn't change. So from a philosophical point of view, I'm not perhaps super happy with this, but I don't think it's wrong to actually state the exact URL that was used either. It could be unnecessary, but it's not wrong. So this is not part of IFL yet. I'm working on a pull request to primarily update the documentation to capture basically this presentation, but in prose form instead. And also, of course, make these minor changes to the protocol. And that's something that's going to help us capture both the intention of our builds, but also the exact image that was used. And that's hopefully something that can be useful for others as well. Any questions or objections? Yes.
Just a question. When you refer to the artifact uploaded, you refer to latest. So that's sort of not a particular, it's currently the latest.
Yes.
So if you want to sort of use that in a long perspective, you're not using the sort of the sharp references, which is a more precise identity, but instead you are referring to a sort of process that will eventually give you the latest or the most stable one. But what if you really want to have the particular version? I mean, not the latest, but the particular one. And you want to do that in a published perspective, you will never find it. Or how would you suppose to find a particular version of a container if all the references you have in the published would be just the latest? But if we want to have the latest but one, for any very particular reason, I want to pull that off after something more has been published. How do I do that?
Oh, I think what you're asking is if you want to get something that isn't the latest right now. Okay. Yeah, you could enter the SHA-256. That is a valid way of addressing.
But is that available through the artifact published one, or do I need to sort of link it back and look at the artifact created?
Oh, you would have to, yeah. So if you want to afterwards, if you have a build that references the artifact published with the latest, and you want to be able to exactly recreate what was used, you would have to follow that link to the artifact created and obtain the SHA-256.
Okay.
So it's an extra jump, but then the benefit is that we capture the intention of the build. It wanted the latest, and this is what it got. And you can always pull this one, assuming the image is still around. Of course, it hasn't been cleaned up.
True, but assume that, for example, you want to do something with a particular container, and you need to be consistent over time of your process. And you don't know if anyone else will sort of push new versions of that container. You need to continue your work with that precise references, and you don't want to lose track on it. And that's why you need to sort of make sure that you always refer to the exact that identity and not the latest or the most stable one. I just want this particular one because otherwise my intent of trying it out fails.
I mean, it's if you want something to be more stable, then don't use latest in your build specifications. Then you should probably use the SHA-256, or depending on you might want to use something like this instead. Depending on, I mean, whether these are mutable, that's up to you as an organization. You could say that maybe you have some mutable like this, but like this, including the date, those are immutable, for example, if you want to have more stability.
Sure. You started the definition by talking about traceability.
Yes.
Stating, for example, I did this test, I run these activities. Then it's really important to make sure that you can pinpoint exactly what identity of the container where it runs. Because if you sort of aiming at a moving target, your traceability is virtually lost.
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly what I wanted to get. To get the traceability without losing the ability to express the intent. Because if you only get this identity here, this is good for traceability. But if you want to show in say a web interface that shows activities, build activities, and you only show this one with the SHA-256, users probably don't want to know that. They want to know, oh, did we build it with Debian Bookworm or Debian Trixie, or was it this or that version of the JDK? That's sort of more user-friendly. But for recreation purposes, or if you have to debug the exact what happened, then of course you want the exact image. And this allows for having both.
So you have to be careful when using the references to not follow the latest, but instead pinpoint your version and then try to stick to it. Just be very careful. So the implementation has to be sort of with that in mind.
Yes, you have to do that, exactly.
As a comment, I do like the sort of, and I don't know if it was intentionally, but you basically get sort of the history and traceability of what is happening to the latest.
Yes.
So you can basically follow what is the sort of the history and trace that. And I think that's sort of a very nice side effect.
Exactly. Because I don't think most Docker registry or container registries, they don't necessarily allow you to do that. So again, frequently you have the more symbolic references like this that aren't locked down to an exact version. And then you want to know, okay, so what, even if you don't, if you have this IFL-based traceability, you'll get to know which exact image it was anyway. But if you are using, you are publishing these kinds of IFL events for your registry, for example, you could get that traceability even for people who don't lock down the image, because you could, using the events, you could see, well, what did the Trixie image point to at this particular timestamp a couple of weeks ago? And that's probably hard with today's Docker registries, unless you want to like dig into the logs of the HTTP server in front of the registry. You could probably figure out that this log entry here probably means that someone updated this tag, but it's not a great option.
Not sure how useful that is, but it seems to be, well, depends on the requirement you have on your traceability. It seems to be potentially quite useful.
I hope so.
Particularly since it is immutable instead of referring to a log, which may or may not exist at all.
Yeah, that too. Yes. Any other questions or comments? Thank you, Bo. Okay.
Volvo, how much is this for you? Are you using?
We're not creating it.
Okay, so you're not using any.
Maybe the testers do, but we are not using.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
before Mattias, working at Ericsson. Continuing the technical dive. And for those that feel that this is way too technical, we are going to go a little bit lighter later on. So don't worry, it's not going to be all of this. Looking at source change events and modeling verdicts of those ones. Trying to get a little bit of situation, what's happening. So say that somebody is pushing some suggestion as a code. We usually say source change events to signal that, and maybe you're doing one patch and then you're doing some changes to another patch, and you're sending it off for review. And one colleague says, "Okay, yeah, this is great. Thank you very much. I feel it's good." But another colleague comes in and says, "Oh no, you need to change something." And I says, "Okay, well, yeah, I reason that is good change." So you make another change, and the colleague says, "Yeah, this looks good." So that kind of like is the scenario. But then the question is, how do you order these two? So you can think of it as this, okay, we've got timestamps in events, so why not just use them? But basically, we have in AFO, we say that we don't want to use conventions, but instead we use links. So we want to have a link. And today, there isn't any really good way to order these ones. And also, if you, for example, got maybe it's the same user that just review and then re-reviews and changing it, or as this case in my example, it was two different users. And then it's a good question is, how do you handle that? You could have, for example, you could have different links in between, or you can let the sender decide in between those there. Any thoughts or in this matter before I go on, because I have a suggestion, but any. You understand the scenario, by the way?
What is the problem to solve?
Most likely, if you want to get a chronological history, or if you want to figure out, okay, what happens before the other ones, you would today most likely have timestamps. You would have to go with conventions. So therefore, you would want to have it. There was probably something else, Magnus, remind me if there was some more when we had this discussion.
Well, I think the original discussion was how do you even model code review events in general? And we'll reach the conclusion that confidence level modified is a good way of modeling code review events. But as opposed to other kinds of confidence level changes, code review scores could change. Of course, you could change confidence levels based on test verdicts. That does happen, but probably more prevalent in code reviews. Plus, you could have different persons giving different scores. As well, I think that's mentioned here.
Did that ask any question, Gustav?
Yeah, I think it's that's to some extent, but I don't know what to think. Yeah, I'm going into product manager mode. What do we spend our time on? So
Well, that's good. We need those ones. So I've been thinking a little bit. So the idea is to have this as a predecessor. Basically saying that, and for those that are not aware about it, we have this rule here that the target event is the source link type, and then they're noun. So then CLM1 here would be the CLM2 predecessor. But then also I just want to point out that we have something called a precursor that we use to order activities in a pipeline. But for this one, might not want to have a precursor. because maybe not a time order there. So the idea then is to have a predecessor in between there. Any thoughts around this? Yes, that people are not having too much thoughts right now, but yeah, if it doesn't sound like, oh no, that's terrible, we'll go on. So I guess the next step will be that I'm preparing a PR to describe how to model verdicts at all on sort of change events there, and then I will also prepare this. That's going to be the next step here.
I'll continue with some other protocol changes that are more or less planned. So regarding activities, we have found that there is a plot hole in the activity lifecycle. So activities can go in one of two ways. Either you start, I mean, all activities are triggered, so there's always an activity triggered. If the activity never actually starts, for example, because it's queued, but for some reason it's taken out of the queue, it's interrupted, you would send an activity canceled. In that case, there is never an activity. For some reason, you just know that this activity will never start. In the other case, you have the activity triggered, followed by activity started and activity finished. That's a normal flow of an activity. And in that case, we have the data outcome conclusion field in activity finished that indicates what happened with the activity, what's the outcome. So it could be successful, unsuccessful, failed, aborted, timed out, or inconclusive. However, there is a case here that we haven't been covering so far, and that's if we are basically canceling the activity after it started. This could, for example, be if we are we have a build avoidance scenario where we realize that we don't have to perform this build, but to come to that conclusion, we have to start the activity. Ideally, we would have it in the uppercase here, where we never even start the activity. We just right away, oh, we don't have to do this. But it could be that the computation to realize that this build has already been built, we can just avoid it. That could take some time and actually require us to start an activity. But in this case, there's really no outcome that really fits this case. It's not an abortion, because that would indicate that either a computer or user interrupted and aborted the build. That's not what we're saying when we're avoiding a build. It's a successful outcome, but it's not necessarily the same thing as successful here. I think arguably it should be possible to distinguish between an activity that successfully runs to its completion and one that successfully concludes that I don't have to do anything. And we can't express that today. So we're suggesting that we introduce another conclusion called canceled. That's basically the same role as the activity canceled event, but after the activity started. It covers a small little corner case, but I think it's useful. We talked about this at a community meeting quite a while back, I think November last year, but then we never really took this across the finishing line. So the discussions we had tried to sort of so we compared this to CD events, the other, in a way, competing event protocol, and they already have a cancel outcome for their equivalent activity types. So that sort of validates that might be onto something here. Another comparison we did was for the test case events. Should they also have a canceled or skipped outcome? In many ways, the test cases and activities are sort of two sides of the same coin in a way. So it could very well be that we should have the same possibility for a test case. Another difference between test cases and activities is that they have both a conclusion and a verdict, which could be a little bit confusing. So the conclusion of a test case is similar to what an activity has. It can be successful, failed, aborted, timed out, or inconclusive. But in addition to that, there's also the verdict that indicates, at least in the, I guess, successful conclusion, you could still have a failed test result. So this split, I think at least, is a little bit confusing. But we talked about, is it something we should mirror in activity finished? And we figured that we could do that, but it's a fairly large change, and it wouldn't bring any significant benefits. So it's probably just a lot of work for not much benefit. But probably the canceled or skipped outcome for test case finished is probably something we'll include in this change. Since same thing there, you could definitely skip a test case before it even starts execution, but it could also be that you don't complete a test case because you skip it. So this is just a proposal. We'll probably implement it pretty soon. It's a small protocol change, so it shouldn't take too much time.
One comment there.
Yes, please.
So the reason I think that the idea with having conclusion and verdict, two split ones, is one is, okay, how is actually is the test able to run or not? And then it is when you're actually running the test or not. And then, okay, how did the test go in itself? So you're kind of like want to model. Do we have like any environment problem, for example, that would not affect the test result as such, but that would be kind of like the running of the test. But then when it's actually running, is the system and the test working or not? Then you want to model that. So that's the reason why you have two different verdict and conclusion.
They're absolutely necessary.
They're absolutely necessary.
Yes.
Yes.
By all means, you couldn't get by with it. If you would sort of put the verdict into the conclusion part, you would just mess things up. Big time.
Okay.
You need to, because they're different sort of entities. The purpose of the testing doesn't really have, as you mentioned, that doesn't have anything to do with whether the actual test itself is sort of successful in its execution. You may be successful in executing the test, yet it failed.
Yeah.
On a testing perspective, you need to be able to express both.
Yes.
So they're different entities. They need to be having their own ways of expressing their results.
Yeah, but you could express them in the same enum. But yeah, maybe the can of worms we shouldn't open right now.
No, but I think this is something that is absolutely necessary. Although it's a little bit complicated to believe it, but I believe it is something that has been identified as necessary and been separated from start. And I do hope that it will continue to be that way.
Yeah. We're not suggesting that.
It also shows why you can't have verdict as sort of a general activity thing, because the verdict is only applicable to the test case. You don't know if that will be applicable to any generic activity at all.
Yeah.
If there were such things, you may sort of want to have a verdict as well, but you can't make sure it does exist.
No, exactly. And that was one of the arguments. On one hand, it's nice to have symmetry between activities and test cases, but they are different. They are different events for a reason. So having a verdict for an activity probably doesn't make sense. So and again, it would be a large change and not worth it. So yeah. Okay, so this is also actually an old thing, but some of you weren't here last year, so let's repeat it. We have upgraded the JSON meta-schema. In other words, the schema of the schema for IFO. So we used to be based on a very old draft of the JSON schema or JSON meta-schema, which lacked a number of features. In other words, things that you might want to express in the schema, you can't express it because the schema is too limited. So now we have a much more recent one. I don't know if there may be a later one. I mean, still 2020, so it's 5 years old almost. But it does mean that we can introduce new ways of validating events. And we have introduced a limited form of link validation was implemented. It's not part of an iField edition quite yet. We also recently actually introduced, Mattias, the thing we merged a couple of weeks ago for What was that?
Yeah,
Oh yes, for the signatures that we're going to talk about on. I'm going to skip around a little bit. Yes, here. So previously, public keys and signatures, if you're using signed events, the documentation did not state the representation of the keys and signatures. It just said that, you know, this field contains a public key. Yes, but is it what format? Is it PEM? Is it DER? What encoding? And so on. So that's now documented, so that you can actually implement the specification without risk of being incompatible with someone else who made another interpretation. And in this case, we used the ability of the more recent JSON schema to express in the schema that this particular field is base 64 encoded of a particular value. So that was good. Right. So again, this makes it easier or decreases the risk of misunderstandings. So when I implemented signing a couple of years ago, I looked at the only existing implementation of signing in the .NET SDK and was happy to find that they made the same interpretation as I did when I guessed at what the implement or the specification authors meant many years ago. So, but now it's documented. Going back, yes. We realized that log URIs, logs are important artifacts of activities and tests. And if you upload them to a location, it would be a shame if someone tampered with the logs afterwards. So we now have the ability to include a digest of the log that was uploaded, both for activities, test cases, and test suites. So you can make sure that it hasn't been changed afterwards. Of course, it's optional. And this is another change that has been merged as well. Previously, for some reason, when you sent a confidence level modified, you couldn't. You obviously you linked to what am I expressing confidence about? Usually an artifact or possibly a source code change, but you couldn't tell, you know, the basis of the decision. For example, a set of tests. That wasn't possible. So it was just expressing an opinion based on something. But nowadays there is a confidence basis link, so you can point to test results, for example. And this is why I made this verdict on this artifact.
A comment on that one.
Yes.
I think in general, when an event is referring to external data, in most cases that external data is supposed to be, you know, linked to or connected to the event, which means that it should also be immutable in general. But referring to an external data, you can't sort of ensure its immutability. But
Correct.
So basically, all external references should have this sort of, you know, immutability by signature or something. So you can basically verify that whatever was the data that was created or linked to at the time of the event creation is exactly what is being stated here. So you know that you have an immutability, not only on the event, but also the external referred data. So I think that should go for this one, but also for all other external references, it should be possible as well.
Yeah.
Extend that work. I think that's good.
Yeah, that's a good point. There are other forms of external references that we should consider having digest for. Yep. Talk about that. I think that was actually the last. So I think this multi-part presentations have covered all the changes that are planned in the short term. There are other more long-term changes also. Primarily, I think the big one is the source change events. If you have been following these summits for a few years, you know that we've been talking about source change events, and they are difficult, and so we haven't taken them to across the finishing line yet. But that's, I think, the major other ongoing change. Not ongoing, but it's in the works. We also want to add a dedicated event for source code tags. That might happen in a slightly shorter term than the whole revamping of the source change events. That's it's very time consuming. We talked about it for many hours, and it's hard to reach a conclusion. Any other questions? Was there anything you'd like to see covered here that you want to see?
To sort of raise things because it started to discuss about the signing part, which is basically about sort of making sure that the integrity is good. But I believe it's also to have an identification of the person who issued, and by raising the discussion about who issued the event, then the question would be, would there be a need for authority check, meaning how do I know that this identity has the right to express this information about this information? I mean, do we know? I mean, it's like reading a newspaper. You read it. How do you know that it's the truth? And you trust the one that wrote it. So the question is there need for authority in terms of expressing things in event-based things? You have sort of an object, you say something about the object. How do you know that the identity has the right to express things about that object?
Mm-hmm. Tomorrow at 9, I'm going to talk about certificate authorities for signing events. So that definitely applies there.
We can save that question for later.
Yeah, it makes sense, but it is still actually relevant to. I mean, that presentation is going to cover how you use certificate authorities to verify that whoever the sender of an event claims to be something, someone, but still. And you can verify that, but it still, does that entity, that identity, have the authority to express something about a particular artifact? That's not really covered by what I'm about to talk about tomorrow. And I think that's sort of where you're coming at. And that would require some kind of access control list.
It is basically about sort of defining objects in general, and then state who has the ownership of that object, and therefore also have the right to express changes of references, life cycle, and so forth about that object, and having that being represented in a good way somewhere. Because I do believe that if one should take events even further, one should believe also that we need to have a way to ensure the truthness of that information, so we can sort of verify that it comes from a valid source, the source also has the right to do and so forth, so we can have a very sort of high quality, even though the events are supposed to be sort of spread around the world. It's like, finding a piece of newspaper on the bench that you're sitting on and reading it, and then you should always know that whatever I read here is basically the truth, without any doubt, and sort of you can verify that it is the truth. And that's a hard thing about events, because they're sort of, based on trust. Trust is not a very good model in this world anymore. It's sort of you need to be able to verify it, and so forth. So I believe that's a challenge.
It's about integrity.
Well, integrity is one thing, but also making sure that, I can have integrity, but I don't have the right to express things. So it's about the authorization of expressing things on objects, and to make sure that we can sort of trust that that person has the right to say this on that object. And if we can do that, and with integrity and so forth, then we know that the information is sort of valid to act upon. But probably that only goes for very sensitive events, not to everyone, but the option should be there for very sensitive events.
Oh, that's interesting. I wonder if that's something that could be standardized in some way. But maybe pause that discussion until.
But that's an entirely sort of different section of discussions.
Yeah.
We'll sort of put the idea here before lunch.
Yeah.
After one, I guess you have all code, so sort of use the time before.
Possibly, yes. No, but it's a different. I mean, it's certificate authority will make sure that you can trust the identity of the sender, but whether the identity has the authority to express something about something else, that's an entirely different matter.
Exactly.
Could be, at least.
Yes.
Good. All right. So, that case.
For example, confidence levels.
Yes.
You don't trust anyone to state something about confidence level. It must come from a authorized source.
Yes. Definitely.